And now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of the day. Scott Trevino is Senior Vice President of Cybersecurity, and in this capacity, he leads efforts to define the strategy to deliver value, growth, and evolution of TriMedex cybersecurity solutions. He is responsible for identifying trends in cybersecurity technology, as well as recognizing and anticipating the evolution of clients, marketing, and industry needs to translate them into market-leading solutions that meet the needs of and bring value to clients. Prior to joining TriMedex, Trevino spent over 20 years at GE Healthcare, holding multiple leadership positions in product management, product development, services, technology engineering, operations, and quality and regulatory. He actually moved around quite a bit as far as all those disciplines. That's wonderful. Scott earned an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, as well as a Master of Science in Computing and 2 bachelor's degrees in Computer Science and Psychology from Marquette University. Please join me in welcoming Scott Trevino.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm honored to be here and privileged. Thank you all for coming. I'm here to talk about something I'm very passionate about. But before I do, I want to thank Amy for the opportunity to speak to each of you today about that and say Happy Father's Day to all the fathers in the audience. Today, I'd like to talk a bit about some changes around regulations and legislation as it pertains to cybersecurity and how we do our jobs. We'll talk a bit about the healthcare trends at a macro level to set context to understand the complexity of the world that we operate in, and then drill down into specifically what's happening around medical device cybersecurity, the need for and recent legislation, what that means for us, what changes it means, what changes it doesn't mean, and then hopefully leave you with some thoughts on how to apply some tactics to improve our risk posture around cybersecurity for medical devices. So with that said, why don't we jump in and get started? So from a macro level, when we look at healthcare, there's really a confluence of multiple things that are happening today that create a great deal of complexity and challenges, as you all may well know. From a patient standpoint, there's increased delays in treatment, canceled procedures, concerns about risk and safety that continue to be exacerbated, of course, during COVID and continue thereafter. From a hospital financial standpoint, there's significant challenges around revenue. There's inflationary costs, challenges around OpEx increases, as well as retaining human capital and talent. When we think about safety and risk, it's an evolving environment. Cybersecurity is a huge part of that, but there's also the regulatory and compliance concerns, device recalls, availability of devices, supply chain challenges that are really driving a number of challenges across healthcare. From a clinician satisfaction standpoint, there's significant challenges there. As we all know, there's a clinician shortage, challenges with retaining talent, investment in training and satisfaction, more stress, more administrative tasks are driving a number of concerns here. From a technician satisfaction standpoint, similar issues, increased workload, evolving environment. The tools that were necessary to do the job 10 years ago are changing quickly. There's a need for more IT, more software skills, more cybersecurity skills as medical devices become more and more empowered by software. So again, a number of significant macro challenges in healthcare that are occurring today that really are exemplified by a couple key pieces of data that I want to highlight here. Number one, staffing shortage is a huge issue, and it really ties into and right up there with patient safety. It's really what it's all about. Do you have the staff necessary to not only, serve the patients directly with clinicians, but maintain the devices so patients can get served? From a financial standpoint, I wanted to highlight just one piece of data when we talk about the financial challenges in healthcare. The cost of drugs and labor alone in the last year went up almost 25%. The other piece here that was really eye-opening to me is that 1/3 of hospitals are operating in the red. They're not profitable. And that's considerably significant when you think about the challenges when you determine what you're going to invest in. You have shortages of talent, you have increasing costs, inflation, and you also have an increasingly challenging threat landscape. And that's what I want to highlight here in the end, is that in the last 5 years, the amount of ransomware attacks has increased over 200%. That's pretty considerable. And when you think about what that threat landscape looks like, I'd go even further, and I want to share something that was really eye-opening to me, is that for the last year we have data for, the amount of weekly attacks on healthcare systems has gone up 86%. To put that in perspective with real numbers, that's going from 750 attacks on a weekly basis on average, which is a considerable number, to over 1,400 attacks weekly. And you may say, well, why is that? Well, what I would put out there and postulate is that attackers aren't going to go after targets that are hardened and difficult to go after and aren't valuable. And so you have a couple things going on here. Healthcare information is very valuable, but you also have the fact that healthcare as a critical infrastructure is probably the least mature from a cybersecurity standpoint, the most vulnerable for a couple of reasons, or at least I'll highlight for a couple of reasons. One, you've got the uniqueness of medical devices. You can't just take a Microsoft OS patch and apply it to medical devices across the board like you would with laptops. Those patches have to be validated by the OEMs for each make model of device that may be affected. The validation of those patches then has to be released and then applied. Typically, the application of those patches would have to be done by somebody like you, a trained professional who knows how to work on medical devices, is willing to touch and not afraid to do so. Traditional IT typically is not willing or maybe not accountable in a hospital typically to do that type of work. So there's that challenge there. When you look at the processes of what a biomed shop runs versus an IT shop, oftentimes those things aren't integrated. So if you look at the maturity of a robust cybersecurity program within healthcare, there's a lot of challenges there which create a lot of gaps. A lot of gaps in sensitivity, detectability, the ability to remediate quickly. All those things are there, which creates opportunity. What I'd also say is that the endpoints have significant challenges, the devices themselves. So many devices, our legacy devices, may or may not have been designed with the idea or put the design thought and purpose into secure by design or design principles to help address known current as well as be extensible for future needs so devices can be upgraded and addressed. Some devices may not have been designed to be networked and are ex-post networked devices. So you have vulnerabilities in devices, and I'll highlight some of those issues there. But the ultimate thing I would highlight here, and it'll be a trend throughout, is that healthcare is the most significantly behind, the most significantly attacked. And it really comes down to, at the end of the day, we talked about the technology of the devices, but also the people in the process to put together a robust system to address cybersecurity. What I want to talk about next a bit here is about some specific cyber trends. There's significantly fantastic innovation around medical devices, which is just awesome, delivering value for patients and outcomes and treatments. With innovation is sort of the dual-edged sword, which as you continue to digitize and create connectivity, you also open up new vectors for threats, new challenges and new risks. I want to highlight some of the overall cyber trends that we're seeing here and that might resonate with you folks in the room. Number one, I talked about the number of attacks going up significantly. What we see is also, for the last 11 years in a row, the healthcare system has had the highest average cost per breach, and in 2021 had a record number of breaches at $10 million per breach. So a significant financial impact to what we're talking about. There's also reputational impact, and I'll argue patient safety impact for breaches in hospital systems, and I'll share some data on that later. Just imagine extrapolating those events across the entire industry and what an anchor or a drain that puts on the industry as a whole. What we look at next here is the increase in the number of connected devices. In a recent survey, of hospital systems, over 50% of devices out of 74% of hospital systems have 50% of devices connected to the network. So the threat landscape's increasing. The number of eligible targets and vulnerable targets has increased considerably. And in fact, that's been a trend that's been ongoing and accelerating and will continue. And in fact, almost a third of those surveyed also show upwards of 70% of devices are connected. Let's talk about vulnerabilities. We talked about attacks, we talked about threats and costs. It's estimated that 53% of medical devices in use today have a critical vulnerability that's exploitable, that's unaddressed and unremediated. And that's just the critical vulnerabilities. That's not the high, the medium, the lows, just the highest risk potential. Over half of devices are potentially vulnerable. You may say again, why is that? Well, again, there's probably a multiplicity of factors here. I'll name a couple of the key ones that I think are most important. And this will sound very simple, but you got to know what you have. Inventory accuracy is a huge challenge. It's not just, do I know about the device, but the attributes necessary on a device that need to be collected to understand vulnerability are different than what's been traditionally collected. What do you mean by that? Well, MAC address, OS revision number. When you look at what's vulnerable, in order to know what is vulnerable, you need to know what you have, but you need to know what you have down to a level of precision to determine whether you're truly vulnerable. That's a part of it. Another part of it is, in my experience, the majority of medical device vulnerabilities, at the very least, have very slow releases for remediation, and in many cases never get a remediation or a patch. So the requirement there then is to go, how do I mitigate, not remediate the risk, a compensating control, and that takes a set of skills. It takes decision-making across the boundaries we've talked about to say, how am I going to go address those vulnerabilities? And in many cases, they're not addressed, and that's what this data, I think, reflects. So I think those are some of the challenges that we see there. You know, there's a transition of care that's affecting the threat landscape as well. You know, the estimate is that I see here recently is by 2030, 44% of procedures will be happening in a non-acute setting, whether it's skilled nursing unit, at home. I think we're seeing that driven by patient demand and some of our changing landscape. One of the other challenges I think we're all aware of is talent shortage, both on the biomed side, but also on the IT InfoSec security side. In the US alone, there's a 700,000 person shortage for people with cyber skills, and that's generally across traditional InfoSec cybersecurity. Globally, that's over 3 million, a shortage of 3 million folks. So when we think about the complexity of that skill set, the training that's necessary just on the IT side, you compare that with, on the biomed side, we've got similar challenges. And we go, well, we need people with both skills in one person. And I sometimes refer to that as trying to find the unicorn, right? But I think we're moving in the right direction. We need to move further and quicker in that direction to help address this challenge. But I think that helps set a bit of the landscape here. One of the other challenges that's happening here around cybersecurity has to do with cyber insurance. In the last year alone, the cost of premiums have gone up over 100%. That's significant. And the other challenge is that's if you can get insurance or reinsure, which is not a guarantee. When we look at the requirements for cyber insurance, there's the range of questions that can be asked for insurability can range anywhere from 50 questions to 200 questions. There's no standard today, and there's no guarantee of getting reinsured. We'll talk today about how we can address cybersecurity, and what I've seen is by doing some of the things we'll talk about, putting the right people, the right processes, and the technology together to help remediate risk, to understand risk, to monitor and be able to respond can help with this, but there's no guarantee. There's also less coverage, wider exclusions. Understanding what your coverages are based on the type of attack or breach that you might have is also a big challenge. And what I would say is that I had the privilege recently to talk to a chief underwriting officer of a major insurer to talk about this. And it was really eye-opening to hear him discuss this and talk about that company, quite a large insurer, avoids cybersecurity in healthcare for all the reasons I just highlighted, all the challenges that are there. So it's a major issue that needs to be considered and looked at from a healthcare perspective and understand the context within which we operate. There's obviously operational disruptions when a cyber event, an incident occurs. There's reputational impact. There's patient impact. For those that have had incidents, 70% have reported that there has been delays in treatment, procedures and results have changed, and what I would argue is that those things, delays in treatment, is a patient safety issue. And it's correlated directly with an increase, 36% increase in complications for those patients in the hospitals that have had a cyber incident. We see 65% have reported that there's been an increase in diverting or transferring patients to other facilities. Again, I'd argue a very significant patient safety issue. Imagine, if you will, you're in an ambulance, you're being routed to a level 1 trauma center. You only have one level 1 trauma center in the immediate area, and they've undergone a cyber incident. You have to be rerouted. And if you need level 1 treatment, who knows how long that might take. Or you may end up at a facility that doesn't have that capability. I'd argue, again, that's a patient safety issue. And we'll talk a bit about, cybersecurity in general doesn't result, I talked before about saying, there's not always validated patches that are provided to remediate vulnerabilities. You saw there's 53% of devices have critical vulnerabilities that are open and unresolved. Why is that? What's the compelling reason to act? In most cases, there isn't. Those vulnerabilities don't equate to the level of risk that requires a recall of mandatory remediation action. And so that's part of the challenge that's happening here. I'll highlight one other piece of information here is during cyber incidents, on average, there's 2.5 class action lawsuits against the facility that undergoes such an incident. Again, another very significant impact to healthcare and to understand what the field looks like in terms of the incidents that occur. Let's talk a little bit about remediation and responsiveness, right? Cybersecurity is not just an IT concern. When we think about breaches that happen in healthcare, and I talked about healthcare as a critical infrastructure being one of the most challenging, one of the most least mature, and some of the challenges that go with it. Let's put it into real terms here and talk about averages in terms of identification of breach. Talked about having the right people, process, and technology in place to do this identification. Right now, on average, it takes over 200 days to identify a breach. That's more than 6 months. And this number is improved from the previous number that I've seen. So you identify the breach, then the question is, how long does it take to respond to that breach and contain the breach? It's another 70 days on average. That means some are a little quicker, some are longer. These things all contribute to that $10 million of cost that I talked about before, the disruption in healthcare that occurs as a result, in the patient care. It's driven, the cost is driven by all the things you might think of. Revenue associated with patient procedures that are lost, maybe patients that never come back and procedures that are never regained, remediation costs, regulatory legal costs, fines, lawsuits, as I mentioned before, insurance premium increases. There's also, of course, and most importantly, patient safety issues, brand reputation issues. Again, this is a reflection of data, I think, supporting sort of my position about the maturity of healthcare. It's driven in large part by not having the right integration of the right skill-setted people, the right trained people, with the right processes to enable work that's robust and comprehensive across the threat landscape for medical devices and across the framework of NIST, the ability to identify, monitor, detect, respond, recover. So what can be done is to get those folks in place, put those processes in place, begin that journey and move from reactive to proactive. What you see here really is reaction versus proaction reflected in this data. So given all the things I just went through, kind of setting the stage for what's happening here in industry around medical device cybersecurity, and in particular, the overall context, there's been a real urgency in DC around how to respond. And you can tell it's a latent effect, right? If you're waiting for legislation, by the time you wait for legislation, the problem already exists, and I think that's what I'm trying to highlight here is there's a significant issue for cybersecurity within healthcare. And so as a result, there's been a huge legislative focus. There's been numerous bills proposed over the last several years. Most recently, since 2021, there's been 4 bills that have become law. I sort of reflect back to my younger days when I think about reviewing all these bills and what's become legislation and all the activity. And you may all remember Saturday morning cartoons and Schoolhouse Rock. They had one called I'm Just a Bill. Well, for me, that was probably at the right level to understand the process, or at least get back into it to understand, hey, there's been all this activity, all this discussion about potential bills on cybersecurity, but what does it really take to become a law? And that's a significant process. So you'll see a lot in the news about proposed legislation. Not a lot of it becomes full legislation. However, we see an acceleration of the amount of those bills that have been passed into law just in the last 2 years or so. In addition to legislation being passed, we see a number of executive orders out of the White House around cybersecurity at a national level, the majority of which are not specific to healthcare. They're more general, foundational, national security based. And there's also what I would say a proliferation of playbooks, standards, best practices, guidances, which are all fantastic, and I could probably spend an hour just on any one of them to go through. And that's also what I would say is an accelerated response to some of the data you see here. They're all good, but it can be difficult to wade through all of those. What I want to highlight, and I'll get to in just a moment around the legislation, is the majority of the legislation you'll see is also foundational. It's blocking and tackling. It's empowering government to work with the private sector. It's enabling government to work with federal, state, local government, work across agencies to allow alerting, do communication, those sorts of things. But most recently, with the Consolidated Appropriations Act, the Omnibus Bill, there's some very specific requirements around medical device cybersecurity that we'll dive into. When we look at the landscape here for regulation and legislation that's been done, I kind of put a basic timeline here, and I want to highlight what I've got here are mostly the legislation that's been passed related to cybersecurity, and I want to highlight a few different things. One, you can see, as I mentioned, there's an acceleration of legislation in the last 2 years, right? If you look from 2000 to 2020, you only see really 4 pieces of legislation passed. They're all general process, communication type stuff. In the last 2 years, not even 2 years, 4 pieces of legislation have passed. There's been also a couple executive orders. And you may say, Scott, why'd you put the QSR in 1978 in here that, this establishes good manufacturing practices? Well, I kind of want to put a flag in the sand to say, well, that's really where GMP came into place. And 20 years later, in the mid-90s, late 90s, design controls was added as a requirement for medical device design. And what's design controls? Well, at its most simple level, it's for your product design. You have to define what it does, how it does it, its capabilities. You need to verify that it does what it says it does, and you need to validate that it works for the user, basically. But in addition, and most importantly, as part of design control, you have to identify for what that device does, what are the risks associated with that device? And for those risks, how are you mitigating those risks? You can use tools like FMEA and so forth. So, right, a very simple example is I have a powered device. Do I apply the right electrical standards, power and grounding? Well, what I'd argue, and it's straightforward in a design control piece, is if I'm a network device, I have certain risks that I need to identify and mitigate. And I don't say this to be a Monday morning quarterback, but rather to say the design control is pretty elegant and defines the requirements to mitigate and identify risk, and that's been in place since the 90s. But you can see the data, you can see what's happening in industry. Truly, there's a need to improve, is what I would say. I go back as far as the mid-90s. I was doing remote logins, telnetting in, FTPing with medical devices. So this isn't new, but it is accelerating, is what I would highlight. I add the Safe Medical Devices Act here too, which is a requirement to report on death and serious injuries related to devices with a patient. So again, delay of treatment, I get rerouted to another hospital, something happens, I have a complication. Should those things be reported? I think that's one avenue to consider when we talk later about the new legislation that's going to compel vulnerability disclosure and remediation and patching. What I'd like to do is go into a little bit more detail about the most recent legislation that's passed. And I mentioned the first 3 of the 4 that have happened in the last 2 years are really focused on procedural government working with each other. For the first one, the State and Local Government Cybersecurity Act of 2021 really provides for DHS to do cybersecurity assessments and provide technical assistance. There's a grant program for cyber implementation as part of this. Again, you'll see this theme throughout all the legislation, and I haven't had time to go through each one, but there's a lot about information sharing in the legislation, the ability to share information both interdepartmentally within the government as well as with private sector. And this adds some capability for collaboration from a federal, state, and local level as part of this legislation. So not real impactful to medical device, but necessary. There's also an executive order that happened in 21. And again, this established things within the government like zero trust requirements for agencies, as well as modernizing the architecture for networks to harden them and employ modern practices to help with cybersecurity. In 2022, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act defined or required that critical infrastructure operators as well as federal agencies report cyber attacks to CISA and do that within 72 hours of an attack and 24 hours after a payment. The subsequent Strengthening American Cybersecurity Act of 2022 does something similar. It expands that to civilian agencies to report to CISA and also presents a risk-based approach for coordination with federal agencies. So again, procedural process type stuff that's been put in place, 3 of the 4 pieces of legislation around cybersecurity. The final one here, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, actually provides some very specific requirements around medical device cybersecurity. It requires OEMs to ensure medical devices are secure. It empowers the FDA to act on these requirements and enforce them as part of the pre-market approval process for medical devices. It also puts in some requirements around reporting, guidance, resource requirements, and so forth. And I'll talk in more detail about what that means. But before I do, I'll highlight that there's also been, from the Biden White House, a national cybersecurity strategy release. It's interesting from the perspective of the nation, which is it now empowers agencies within the government to have more autonomy to play offense against potential threat actors versus always reacting after the fact. So I find that quite interesting, again, not specific to healthcare. And recently, I talked about proposed bills. One of the more recent ones is a Rural Hospital Cybersecurity Enhancement Act has been proposed recently, which is targeted at addressing some of the challenges with training and talent for our rural health systems because they're not immune to cybersecurity. In fact, face a number of unique challenges as a rural system. So let's look at the Consolidated Appropriations Act. This is the $1.7 trillion budget for the US, $2.9 billion of which is dedicated towards cybersecurity. It's a 4,155-page document. There are 5 pages specific to medical device requirements for cybersecurity, which is fantastic, and I'll go through what that means. I think it's page 3537 to 3542 for those interested. I also think that although this isn't official, it should have an indication of use for the cure of insomnia. So if you have trouble sleeping, feel free to read this. So let's go through in a little more detail what those 5 pages say. So it empowers the FDA to act, right? So this is to ensure the devices submitted in the pre-market for approval to FDA do what they say they do, that they are designed with cybersecurity in mind, and that means not just secure today and anticipating known bad, but how is my design extensible for the future so I can update, so I can patch, so I can address the future unknown, which I know will happen, but I may not know exactly what. It also defines what is and what is not a cyber device. The pre-market requirements on an OEM for submission of these new devices require a software bill of materials, essentially a bill of materials, but it identifies the key software components in the device, right? So off-the-shelf software, SOUP, software of unknown provenance, critical components, open source software, and that's critical. Remember back, the 53% of devices have critical known vulnerabilities, and I said, well, how do you know what's vulnerable? This is a key part of that can help, because a vulnerability may exist in a off-the-shelf piece of software encapsulated inside a medical device, and today there's no way to know exactly if it's there other than hearing from the OEM to say, oh yeah, that's vulnerable for these models. If I have the SBOM for that device I bought, I can know that right away and help decrease the time to detect and respond. There's also a requirement for a plan to address, monitor, identify, and respond to vulnerabilities and issues with those devices as part of the product design and submission. Vulnerability disclosure is a requirement as well that's called out in the legislation, and the requirement to ensure devices are secure via software firmware patches and updates. It empowers the FDA to act, I said, within 180 days of requirements to provide resources to help with this and to provide help with administering and addressing vulnerabilities for medical devices, and then annually thereafter. There's also the requirement that the GAO report with 1 year on cyber challenges across the industry, including legacy devices. So you didn't hear me say anything yet about legacy devices. This is all pre-market new product submission approvals. At least this is a requirement to report on the current state. And legacy devices are a huge piece of that, and I'll hit on that in just a minute. And finally, there's a requirement to update the pre-market cybersecurity guidance and for the GAO to work with CISA on that. You all may be very familiar that FDA's published and requested comments on the pre-market guidance, so that's underway and feedback has been provided, so we're looking forward to that. So that's essentially what the Omnibus bill provides for. And what I want to highlight is, number one, I think this is a great start. You know, you saw all the other legislation, or at least the ones I highlighted, they're transactional, procedural, foundational type of things at a general level. This is specific to med device, very specific requirements. The requirements, I think, are fantastic. The SBOM, vulnerability disclosure, the requirement to patch, all very good. The biggest challenge here is this is only for pre-market submissions today. And based on my past, I've done analysis to look at what it would take to flip the installed base in market with new product introductions, not even those that require approval from FDA, just adding new product into market. We're talking 20 years. So this is a great start, but we can't sit and wait. If legislation is the only thing we rely on, we will not be able to address the issue. We won't do it effectively. It's a great start, but it's limited in its scope. There's questions around things like the SBOM and the vulnerability disclosure. What are the standards? Where will they be housed? When and how do you need to report those things, especially on the vulnerability disclosure? I mentioned before about most vulnerabilities not rising to the level of risk that requires action or a recall. So does this change how FDA is going to look at vulnerabilities and say, okay, this is a special class. If you have a vulnerability of what criticality and what threat level, I don't know, you have to disclose, and when? By what are the reporting requirements? So those are all open questions. It's a great start, but again, with legislation, it's usually very general. The devil will be in the details of how it's applied. And that gets to my final point, which is how will FDA enforce, and I hate to use the word enforce, how about apply these new rules and work with industry to make sure they're effective? And I think the final piece is the challenge we all face. Right? It's a shared responsibility for cybersecurity across all the constituencies, and we're all competing for those limited resources. So FDA, like everybody else, will need folks that have the expertise I'm talking about to review. So I think those are some of the challenges that are there, but a fantastic step forward and a significant impact to some of these groups that I've talked about. So I want to highlight the healthcare providers, the in-house programs, our manufacturers groups, as well as ISOs, and talk maybe about some of the impacts that we see across those groups from the legislation or things we got to consider. And when I hit on these, don't think of these all as mutually exclusive. Some are, specific to an OEM in particular for design. But I wanted to sort of highlight things to consider when we think about this legislation and the impacts. So OEMs are, if they're not doing this today, executing robust design control, identifying risks, have a strong SDLC, software development lifecycle process in place, employ secure by design and other principles to ensure cybersecurity. That'll be a significantly new change. And in my experience, that's is significant and challenging and costly, both from an investment standpoint, a timeline standpoint, but it's the right thing to do to ensure robust quality and security in our devices. Pre-market approval process, again, the submission process for these new requirements, demonstration of evidence that you meet the requirements I just went through on the front end will be a change. On the review process, that'll be another change. This is new stuff to review, and as I mentioned, who's going to review, to what degree? How do I know what's reported in the SBOM based on whatever those standards and requirements are is adequate or robust or complete? Those are impacts that will need to be considered. And finally, one I want to highlight is the lifecycle support, the post-market support, the vulnerability disclosure, the patching. So today, every OEM is required under the regulations to review patient safety events, device events, review the risk of those events, and determine what action, if any, is necessary. If disclosure is required, to my point earlier, does it leverage the existing process for risk assessment and determining whether or not something is a recall or a mandatory action? That could be a significant impact here for the OEMs. From an ISO standpoint, depending upon how the legislation's enacted and enforced, this could be a very good thing for all servicers to provide those patches, the software and firmware, the availability of that, the disclosure of an SBOM, the disclosure of vulnerabilities in a standard way can create huge efficiencies for all servicers. I think is fantastic. Demand for cyber expertise, I put it here, but it applies to all. That's a challenge and an impact for everybody. And really highlights the shared responsibility here and the need for collaboration, which happens today across servicers with OEMs and in-house programs. What I'd say for the in-house programs, many of these that I mentioned already apply, but the key thing is, what do I do today? I've got numerous legacy devices. I've got vulnerabilities that exist on all of those devices today. I've got an increasingly complex and threatening landscape where I'm getting attacked. So I can't wait for this legislation to turn over the installed base with new products. We need to employ and address cybersecurity through the right people in the process and the technology, while at the same time understanding, what this legislation may or may not mean, maybe help with questions on new capital purchase decisions, and the like. So what can you do? Well, I wanted to start with some of the basics here, right? Get involved, tune in, subscribe, be proactive, participate. We could spend, there is so much published around cybersecurity and just on the medical side alone that you could spend your entire day doing it, but I would say start somewhere. Build a filter, understand what's appropriate, what's important to your facility, your health system, that can help you understand how to separate the wheat from the chaff, what articles are important. Internally, get engaged with, maybe you have a legal team or advocacy group that gets involved on health issues. Cybersecurity should be one of those, and that might be an area and an avenue for help. Get involved and participate, contribute, give feedback on guidance and standards. They're available for public commenting, many of them. I listed before a number of non-legislative activities that are occurring. Volunteer, I know it's extra time, but it'll pay off and it'll help. Those are some of the basics. I'll talk a bit about the people, process, and tech next, but before I do, I want to reiterate a couple of the key challenges that are unique to healthcare. I mentioned the people situation, right? Shortage of both cyber security expertise, biomed expertise, and the combination of the two in one individual is a unique challenge given the nature of medical devices. Processes, right? So we all have great processes for HTM program. Do we have documented processes on how we do inventory, preventative maintenance? Do we have patching and compensating control procedures? Do we have incident response procedures that tie biomed into the IT incident response for cybersecurity? In my experience, typically not. That's new ground in most cases. Some are ahead of the curve, of course, in doing that. What about vulnerability threat monitoring and response? Are there procedures and processes in place within our biomed shops for that, for our medical devices? That's typically pretty new. And finally, I'll just highlight from a technology standpoint, I mentioned before the challenges with inventory and collecting the right attributes into what truly is vulnerable from a medical device cybersecurity standpoint. The CMMS is not enough, right? If you're going to manage and really drive down the times from detection and understand vulnerabilities and anomalous behavior on devices on the network, you need to put in place some technology to monitor those devices. to identify those devices, to know not only what's connectable in my CMMS, in my inventory, but also what's connected, where it's connected. It also will help you find devices that you don't have in your CMMS that you see on the network and go, holy cow, I have an ultrasound on a guest network. Interesting. That's a risk. So there's some unique challenges in healthcare. So with those unique challenges, what we typically see are the people and the processes and tech are siloed. We need to integrate those into a comprehensive, sort of ubiquitous solution between IT and biomed to deliver a robust cyber solution. And what I would put forth here is that you want to integrate those people and processes in a way that helps fulfill the requirements of NIST, or at least the framework, right? The ability to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And what does that look like? Well, bring the right expertise together, integrate biomed and IT to the extent of understanding that common overlap. If you think of the Venn diagram of where does biomed overlap with IT and the cyber side, identify that, work together. Once you've got those people at least identified and the key stakeholders involved, implement the right processes to enable those teams. I talked before about our traditional biomed processes. Expand those. When you do inventory on a device, do you collect the right information? Update that. When I take in a new device I've purchased, do I capture all the information at that point that can help me with cyber down the line? When I PM, I could do those sorts of things. So update procedures and processes, get input from the IT side. Put in place processes to monitor for intelligence around vulnerabilities. That takes active work to go figure that out, and in many cases, those processes don't exist. Along with OEMs, which is a key source of information, understanding what's affected, what remediations, what mitigations are put in place to address. And I mentioned before, IT playbooks, incident response, continuity of service plans should be something that are considered and put in place to help enable your cyber program. So the right people and processes are key. And then what I would say is plugging in the technology to integrate, to reconcile inventory utilizing a medical device security platform that can be integrated with the data from your CMMS so you can create more robust and accurate inventory information. You can profile behavior of medical devices on your network to detect anomalous behavior, respond, understand the vulnerability profile of your ecosystem of medical devices, and bring that all together. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of an eye chart, but I want to talk just a little bit about what this might look like, right? It's easy with the pictures to say people, process, and tech, but what I would highlight here very simply is it all starts with inventory, right? So you take your CMMS inventory. Ideally, you plug in a technology, sensors on the network to see what's truly on your network, and then you reconcile the two. Once you have that inventory, this is all continuous and iterative, but you have a baseline inventory. You can now compare that inventory to your known vulnerability database to see what's truly vulnerable, at what level, and for those things that are vulnerable, what are the available remediations or mitigations. That can all go into a risk prioritization schema along with other information. I would postulate here is that you would take the device risk. What's the consequence of that particular device's failure? What's the context of use of the device? A CT scanner, the same exact model of a CT scanner in a level 1 trauma unit in the ER, has a very different risk profile than that exact same device in a rad clinic that's open Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. And may have the same exact vulnerability. So you have to understand that in addition to knowing what it is and what's available. I would also say that it's important to see other sources of intelligence like FDA recalls to understand the context of that whole device and put that into a risk prioritization schema. And that risk prioritization is going to be dependent on your individual facility, your current situation, but you get the power to do that. You've now got a current state, basically, and you can rank prioritize how you want to go after work and drive action. You'll know what you have, what's vulnerable. For those vulnerable devices, what's the available remediations or mitigations, if any? If there's patches, I can go deploy patches. I can either do it with biomed or IT or some combo, potentially, depending on your situation. Compensating controls. If there's no patch, I may need to develop compensating controls, or maybe I can find a best practice or the OEM might recommend, hey, we don't have a patch, but change this configuration, pull this off the network. You decide to do that and implement that. You're improving your risk posture overall. And you may say there are so many vulnerabilities out there today. There's very low risk vulnerabilities that you may determine have acceptable risk because there's just too much work to do. I can't get to it yet. We know it's a risk, but it's acceptable, hence the first rank in prioritization here. What we've seen in applying these principles is that we can drive down remediation time significantly, upwards of 75%. And a process like this, I think, is very important considering the landscape when you don't always have an immediate remediation. I can't just deploy an automated patch across laptops, across my med devices. The other unique thing here I didn't highlight too much is med devices you can't do active scanning on, right? So the technology I'm suggesting to monitor passively is really important and helps in that unique environment. And finally, I would say this also has the added benefit of informing future capital equipment purchases, right? Understanding what your history has been with devices, device types from certain manufacturers can help you at least inform the process going forward. Questions to ask, considerations on what you're going to buy and why. So how would I recommend you go after implementing a process like this? I talked a little bit about the details, high level, people, process, and technology, kind of the components that fit together in the decision process. I would say there's 3 big things to improve your medical device risk posture that are continuous. It's a continuum to operate, right? It's not I can flip a switch, it's binary, I have it or I don't. It's I'm going to continuously improve here. And what I would suggest is perform a current state assessment for your medical devices and their risk posture, your current cybersecurity state. And I would do that using a current NIST framework. That will help you identify where you're doing well, where you're doing not so well, where there's room for improvement. And it will help you put in place a prioritized action plan on how to go after those things. In parallel and fundamentally, in inventory, improving the accuracy of inventory is critical. You can't know what your risk profile is without understanding what you actually have. And as I mentioned, there's a need to collect attributes. I've seen no case where it's very rare if all those attributes are being collected if you don't have a formal cyber program in place and you understand the need for that. A very specific example, I looked at a number of devices, I'll say monitor devices, I'll leave it at that, that it looked on the surface based on the basic inventory, I had 2,000 different vulnerabilities that needed to be patched. However, I didn't know the precision with which what the OS revision was, MAC address, all these different things. So we went in and physically touched those devices, and it was worth the effort because what we found is there was really only 150 work orders that needed to be issued to address the cyber issue because at a macro level, at a high level, yes, that device type looks like it has a vulnerability, but the devil's in the details. Only specific models, specific revisions are there. So a device inventory is critical. And the final piece is putting together the vulnerability management process that helps you formalize and manage the work, prioritize the work, execute the work, both from a remediation standpoint, integrating with intelligence sources, as well as driving work across the different boundaries that I've talked about. And I would say as part of that, work to upskill your team, invest in education, certifications, and training, encourage your folks to participate in some of the groups that are working on standards, our guidance, our best practices. So specifically, when I talk about current state assessment, I'd recommend using the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's a way to quantify where you stand on very specific components of a robust security program. And what I say is when we look at this, this isn't about judging good or bad. It's a point in time. It's understanding where your maturity level is. And it's helping you get a perspective of something very complex and gives you the power to choose where you want to dedicate the resources you have. You can't do everything at once. It gives you a great perspective on how to do that and make recommendations to improve your program and then go down that journey, which will be a continuous journey to drive robust cybersecurity within your system. I talked about reconciling inventory. I can't overemphasize this. It's critical. The way to do it ideally is to take the data, the inventory from your CMMS, employ technology that monitors the devices connected to your network, and develop a matching algorithm to ensure you're keeping your inventory up to date. You can improve your inventory's robustness in terms of its data through that technology, if you have the luxury to do that, and understand not only what's connected, but what's connectable, so that when you look at vulnerabilities, you may be able to see, well, I've got 100 devices that are connectable and susceptible to this vulnerability, but I only see 80 on the network. Where are those others? When I go deploy the patch, I want to make sure I go find those. And finally, the vulnerability management process. It's really there to respond to risks, identify risks, improve your overall risk posture, and really drive a maturity of the organization around cybersecurity is what I would say. It leverages and should leverage your inventory. That validated inventory can help drive the risk prioritization of work and issue that work from the vulnerability management process. Your process should also involve those intelligence sources, so you're constantly monitoring for new threats in the wild, working with OEMs, building those relationships so when things happen, you can quickly get the help you need, have those conversations. A process like this can also help across the boundaries within an organization, working between biomed and IT. It's really a program management aspect to this as well, I would say, and implementing the ongoing process, the NIST framework, essentially. And finally, incorporated into this would be a strategy around how to increase the expertise within our organization. So with that said, that's all I had for today. Hopefully, you'll take away something new and potentially something valuable that you can apply on your medical devices. And I think we may have a few minutes for questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott. Appreciate it. So we do have a few minutes for Q&A, so do you mind staying and taking some questions?
Absolutely, I'd love to.
All right, so we have 3 microphones, one in each aisle. If you could make your way to the microphones, we're going to take questions. We have about 10 minutes to do this. So get your questions ready and get to the microphone. And we'll start right here in the middle. Go ahead, please, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's certainly a lot to think about. And my question is, for an organization that's new to this way of thinking in cybersecurity, what are some recommended first steps that we could take to tackle some of these challenges?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And I think a lot of organizations are in that position today. I think there's a lot of intimidation with all the information that's coming through. So I think there's a couple things that should be done. One is to look at what the NIST framework is, and maybe not, at a high level, understand the whole concept of how you look at cybersecurity for your system. I think the other key piece, and I kind of talk about action, so that's kind of something that's not immediate but is educational, will help with the framework. I think I would go right to inventory. Inventory's traditionally been very inaccurate. It's critical in the foundation to understanding your risk profile. So I'd say improving the way you approach inventory is an immediate action that can be taken. Even if you don't have any formal cybersecurity effort in place, that'll help build the right foundation.
Fantastic. So let's see if we've got another question. Any other questions from the audience? Here's one coming up on the mic on the left there. Go ahead.
What do you recommend for technicians for training in cybersecurity?
That's a great question. I would say that there's numerous certifications that can be obtained and reviewed. I would say, evaluate those based on the profile of the current state of your workforce and their expertise around cybersecurity. In my particular case, we actually put in place our own training based on some of the existing certifications that are in place
Like
as well.
CompTIA S+?
I'm sorry?
CompTIA S+?
I'm not familiar with that.
No? Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, looks like we've got another question in the middle here.
Just to clarify, you said that the legislation targets pre-market approval, right? I'm assuming it doesn't cover the 510K approval at all, and is there any language to cover those? Because a lot of the devices that come in market, like physiological monitoring, they are 510K and approvals, right? So it's based on approval of an existing device.
Yes, yep. Yeah, so I think that hits on a nuance that I don't have a hard answer to, right? Because you have a predicate device and the approval process, it's not an initial pre-market authorization for a brand new device. So I would look to FDA for some specificity around the application thereof. I had the benefit to have some discussion around this today, and I think, you know, the response I got is be patient. They're working through the details on that, and I think that's a very important question and could have very significant impact as to the scope. So instead of a couple decades, if it goes one way, it could be even further and less impactful because of that situation.
I mean, the number of devices that come out, you know, how many go through PMA versus 510K? I'm assuming 510K has a bigger population.
That's right. Thank you.
Okay, over here.
Thank you for your, oh, that's loud. For
Welcome.
your presentation this morning. One of the other pieces of legislation out there is right to repair. And you talked about having the right access to be able to support, you know, appropriately. Do you see these as opposing forces, or how are these coming together?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. No, I think they overlap in a very specific way, and I think you're kind of leading to exactly that, which is, you know, from a right to repair standpoint, what my position is that servicers need access to the materials to service the device, right? And they need privileged access to get entry into the device to perform the right diagnostics and deploy the right solutions. So I think they're very complementary and overlap considerably. So access to patches, access to information, access to systems is a key component to delivering an effective cyber program for your med devices and directly relates to right to repair. In fact, that's one of the things when I have the benefit to talk about right to repair or cybersecurity with legislators or regulators. That's one of the key points that I make. So I think that's spot on.